A young man steps off a wooden merchant vessel, arriving in sultry Jamestown with dreams of making a fortune, if only he can survive, like so few before him have. After weeks facing the hostile waves and bitter winds of the Atlantic, land should bring relief, but any comfort is brief. He is stepping into a raw and lethal world. Memories of the 1622 Indian Uprising, a horrible massacre, still cast a long shadow across the tidewater. But violence is really a secondary threat. Here, the true killer in this wilderness is invisible. Of the tens of thousands of souls shipped to the Chesapeake before him, only a fraction survive. Most are broken by the summer seasoning, that brutal cycle of disease that systematically clears the clearings of newcomers. Early colonial records show a grim reality. More than 4 out of every 5 settlers among the initial thousands died within months of arrival. 5,000 of the first 6,000 who arrived in Jamestown died. For him, our young man, the numbers are somewhat better. It's 1640 and, well, more survive now, but it's still bad. It's a sobering calculation he must make, something for a 21-year-old who considers himself a gentleman to have to remember and give him a bit of pause. He is, after all, connected to the English gentry by blood, even if his immediate family is in trade in Worcester and London. None of them are worried about such things. But he is here, and he is here to manage their commercial interests, tasked with parlaying tobacco and furs into a family fortune. If he survives, that is, whatever his private anxieties regarding the pestilential and febriferous climate, he intends to do right by the family firms that financed his voyage. But ambition cuts deeper than duty for this young man. He intends to transcend his father and family's station in life and reclaim the status of a landed country squire. Standing on the riverbank of the James in 1640, it will be hard to foresee the scale of his success. But succeed he will. The man we're covering now will go on to become one of the wealthiest men of his generation, amassing thousands upon thousands of acres of prime riverfront property, enough to build a dynasty upon, and founding such a dynasty, one that will echo across American history more than perhaps any other. This is the story of Richard Lee the Emigrant, the patriarch who built an empire in the mud and forests of the New World. Enjoy. Well, everyone, welcome back to The Old World with Will Tanner, the show where we tell the tales of the great colonial adventures, magnificent American and British families of the world that used to exist. Make sure to like this video, subscribe to this channel, and share this video around if you like it. That is how we grow and keep this project going. So last time, we kicked off our history of the first families of Virginia, that topping bedrock of the Virginia gentry that did so much to propel not just the Old Dominion, but America forward. This time, we're beginning our history of Richard Lee I, also known as Richard Lee the Emigrant, the founder of America's great and famous Lee dynasty. There's an elegant, romantic narrative concerning the origins of the American South, particularly Virginia. This, of course, is the legend of the Cavalier, the blue-blooded, aristocratic courtier who fled the puritanical wrath of Oliver Cromwell's England to plant the seeds of chivalry in the fertile, sun-drenched lowlands of the Chesapeake. We've discussed this before, of course, including in what ways it is true and false. But for more than 2 centuries, no family embodied and trumpeted this aristocratic myth more triumphantly than the Lees of Virginia. Their family lore, passed down over generations of planters, statesmen, diplomats, and generals, painted a vivid picture of their founding patriarch, the dynast of the Lees. This man, Colonel Richard Lee I, was widely said to have been a magnificent lord of the realm, a direct descendant of the manorial masters of Cotton Hall in Shropshire, England. According to these old narratives, Richard was a favorite of the Stuart monarchs, and when he came to Jamestown on that wooden merchant vessel with which we began the show, he was encrusted with privilege, bearing an ancient coat of arms, a vast land grant, and a pocket full of favors from the sovereign. He was envisioned as a ready-made nobleman stepping into the wilderness to naturally assume his rightful place at the head of a feudal order in the New World. Much of this, of course, is entirely false. What truth there is in it is largely true of his later years. Arriving with royal privilege is something that came in the 1660s for Richard Lee, not now in 1639 or 1640. But the reality of his birth and arrival is much more modest, and I think makes the story of his rise all the more impressive. But there is some truth to the original tale, which we'll cover briefly here, and then on Wednesday, I'm going to do an addendum show discussing this in depth because it is quite interesting. But while many of the Cavalier fantasies about Richard Lee and the Lee family have been shattered, uh, there is some truth in it. He wasn't, it should be said, a lord who arrived in style. He was a merchant's son who arrived in Virginia to do that thing nobles abhor: business, trade. Emphasizing the full swing of the pendulum back to the side of modesty, Paul Nagel wrote in The Lees of Virginia, quote, "Richard Lee was not from a line of Shropshire gentry, but sprung from a family of Worcester clothers and wine merchants," end quote. So that's the modern impression, but it's not entirely true. Some of the underlying legend is true, as confirmed by the old registers, logs, and tax returns. For one, Richard was a Cavalier, and that he was a royalist, and he was also related by blood to that longtime gentry family near where he was born, the Lees of Cotton Hall. Such is what the College of Heralds found in 1930, establishing, thanks to some proof engraved on a cup and written in a Bible, with both pieces of evidence coming from the 1660s, but believing to originate what was written on in them from somewhat earlier. The Lee family of Virginia was entitled to bear the arms of the Lees of Cotton Hall. And so we know that the Lees can trace their lineage back to a Norman, Rainer de Lega, sheriff of Shropshire about 1200, the first in the family to bear those arms. In any case, however, Norman ancestry aside, by the time Richard Lee I was born, his father, John Lee, appears to have been a local clothier, cloth merchant. His wife, John Hancock, came from a similarly humble station. So this was a family of the English middle class, men who didn't live in poverty, but were in trade. They knew the price of wool, the cost of transatlantic shipping, or closer shipping, and the precise value of a well-kept ledger book. Richard would soon learn all of this and more, and managed to use it quite to his advantage. His older brother, John, had been formerly apprenticed to a wine merchant in the crowded, bustling lanes of London, and it is highly probable that a young Richard soon followed his brother to the metropolis, as his father had died in 1630. A move to London made sense, as there, in the shadow of the London docks, another of Lee's uncles, not the gentleman at Cotton, had established himself as a prosperous merchant, trading overseas on a large scale. And his son, John Lee, succeeded to the business in 1621, and some cousins worked there as well. So Richard would have family in London to help him learn the ropes of trade. Once there, from what we know, Richard immersed himself in the world of international commerce. He learned how to calculate freight margins, how to judge the quality of agricultural imports, and how to spot a golden opportunity on the distant horizons of the expanding British Empire, something his family was already established in and making a great deal in doing. This is a skill he would need, as in 1639 his mother died too, and her will quite favored his brothers John and Thomas. So it was off to America for Richard. Someone had to represent John Lee in the Indian trade, and it would be Richard, there to work as a, quote, English merchant trading in Virginia, end quote, which is still actually how he referred to himself after 15 years in the colony, Clifford Doughty notes. And he was likely there, from what we can tell, to work for his cousin, amongst other things. As Clifford Doughty notes in the Virginia dynasties, quote, as four of Richard Lee's younger cousins went into business with John Lee, and as an association was known to exist between Richard and his cousin John, from the nature of his first trading enterprises in the colony, it has been accepted as a reasonable assumption that Richard learned the family business from his older cousin in London and was representing John Lee in the Indian trade when he first came to Virginia, end quote. So, such is what he was doing, and when Richard Lee boarded an emigrant vessel bound for the Chesapeake around the winter of 1639 or early days of 1640, he was a young man of just 21 years. Whatever his distinguished ancestry or not, He did not possess any baronial titles or hereditary estates, and he had no guarantee of success. He did, however, possess an extraordinary baseline of literacy, a sophisticated understanding of English common law. He was perhaps trained in the law, and a small, but still enough to be highly important, pocket of investment capital. He also, and this was probably the determining factor, had a fierce and burning drive to improve his fortunes substantially in the New World. These were all the things that Governor Berkeley, soon to join him in Virginia, was soon to say that a young man, perhaps a younger brother or a younger son, would need to succeed in the New World. Fortunately for Richard, he had them. He was the quintessential younger son of the English commercial class, squeezed out of any substantial inheritance at home, but armed with enough capital and certainly the skill sets required to make a fortune on this raw and chaotic frontier. So when he arrived across the Atlantic and saw the wilderness that could be transformed through diligence, hard work, and a bit of luck, he saw what could be a personal empire. He also carried with him, and this is important to think about as he arrives, the courage of a man of action, even in this rough and tumble world. This was a quality that would forever define his family, all the generations down. As Burton J. Hendrick observes in his classic study of the family, The Lees of Virginia, Biography of a Family, quote, "The record of the Lee family has consistently been one of leadership, integrity, and high courage since they first came to Virginia. They had from the start what someone has termed the Virginia habit of command," end quote. It was this habit of command, along with the raw ambition and enterprising genius to make full use of it, that Richard Lee was soon to use the legal, political, and commercial institutions of colonial Virginia to carve an unmatched dynasty out of the American soil, one of the first real landed dynasties in America. Lee also had some connections, given his family's mercantile success, and this was of the utmost importance, for to survive and prosper in the volatile, disease-ridden environment of early colonial Virginia, an ambitious young newcomer needed more than just work ethic. That alone could get him killed working in the fields in the seasoning period, or lead to him wasting his time laboring when he could be acquiring. No, to be a success, he needed patronage. Richard Lee secured this by attaching himself to the entourage of Sir Francis Wyatt. Wyatt was not only a highly respected English gentleman who had been chosen by the crown to serve his second term as the royal governor of Virginia, but he was also arriving in the colony in the late autumn of 1639, preceding the infamous Governor Berkeley. More on Berkeley in a bit. So, when Lee arrived at Jamestown to represent the family in the Indian trade, he was able to work with Wyatt and establish himself not as a field hand or a farmer, but thanks to his learning and connections, as a valued administrative professional in Wyatt's circle. His superior literacy, particularly in the legal context, and his handwriting and ability to use it in this circumstance quickly paid dividends. By the early months of 1640, the colonial records, which we have, indicate that just 22-year-old Richard Lee had been officially appointed as the clerk of the quarter court at Jamestown, a huge advancement for such a young man. Some suspect his connections allowed him to arrive in Virginia with the appointment of clerk of the quarter court in his pocket, but regardless of whether he arrived with it or not, it was his by this point in 1640. And it's important to realize the immense value of an office like this for a young man like Richard Lee. Just imagine what Jamestown really was in 1640. It was cramped, muddy, and bug-infested, to be sure, a river outpost in a febriferous climate, to say the least, but it was also one through which came much of the legal wrangling and patenting surrounding the land trade in the colony, while everyone there was trying to get as rich as possible, as quickly as possible, and doing whatever they could to get away with and succeed in that. This typically meant accumulating tobacco land by hook and by crook, and so Jamestown was in some ways like a boomtown of later days, though the men flowing through it and their lawsuits weren't going after oil land, but rather tobacco soil. So Richard got to witness all of this firsthand and learn from it without putting his capital at risk. Indeed, he was earning a great deal of money at least for Virginia, as the clerk of the quarter court. So he got to sit at the center of the colonial information pipeline, as it were, learning the ins and outs of the Virginia real estate market while he was doing things like recording land patents, witnessing major commercial transactions, and just rubbing shoulders with the wealthiest, most powerful, tobacco planters in the New World. And of course, coming through there were the rogues gallery of newmen and speculators, people of the sort he would learn to avoid if possible. So he wasn't just observing power. He, thanks to this position inside Wyatt's circle, was learning how to pull the institutional levers to secure land and influence in a rapidly expanding colony, one with immense profit potential that he could use to his advantage. So, while learning the machinery of Jamestown and the legal machinery of the land market in particular, Richard Lee also managed a masterstroke of personal and social advancement in the colonial marriage market. This was something for which the Virginia gentry was soon to become famous, but as with many things, it was Richard Lee the First who led the pack. And around 1641, he wed a beautiful, highly connected young Englishwoman named Anne Constable. Anne was no ordinary immigrant. She, like Richard, had made the perilous Atlantic crossing as a favored member of Governor Wyatt's household and circle. For whatever reason, she came to Virginia. We don't know. But she was quite the catch, which we do know, particularly for a man like our young hero. Back in England, she had lived under the protection of Sir John Thorogood, a powerful and affluent courtier who served as the personal gentleman-in-waiting to King Charles I. Her marriage to Richard was a massive social victory for the young clerk from Worcester, a young man on the make who was by no means already established as a great man. By binding his fate and fortune to Anne Constable, Lee didn't just secure a devoted and lifelong partner, though the marriage appears to have been a good match, but he also plugged himself into the sophisticated network of transatlantic influence and courtly prestige that was to command deep respect among the planter elite of the Chesapeake. He managed to advance a few rungs socially with this marriage, for Anne brought to the marriage much that was to help him. For one, with this gentlewoman of England came an uncompromised family dignity far in excess of what Richard could have mustered up on his own, along with a deep familiarity with the social expectations and outlook of the English upper classes, and a lineage that Virginians and Englishmen recognized as a part of the elite. Unlike with Richard, there was no myth about her. So together, Richard and Anne, this partnership of the old and the new, formed a formidable and highly ambitious couple, even in Virginia, and one that was perfectly positioned to ascend to colonial society's summit and found a great dynasty that was to shape world history in more ways than one. Began here. So by 1642, Richard was in a prime position to succeed. He had yet to acquire any land. That was to come later. He actually went the first 5 years in Virginia without acquiring a single acre. And it came after he was assured of Governor Berkeley's favor. But he was plugged into the highest reaches of power, learning the ropes of the land business, accumulating some capital, a man on the make. But this was colonial politics in the 17th century, and so major change was always looming on the horizon, as indeed happened in 1642, when the British Crown recalled Governor Wyatt and replaced him with one of the most towering, fierce, and uncompromising figures, even of early American history. This was Sir William Berkeley of Bacon's Rebellion fame, or infamy, depending on who you ask. Berkeley was a passionate High Church royalist. He was educated at Oxford, and he was an intimate court favorite of King Charles I. His family was well plugged in with the royal family. So Governor Berkeley arrived in Jamestown burning with a desire to transform Virginia into a highly stratified, fiercely loyal replica of the English rural hierarchy, to fuse church, state, and property, as we discussed before in our episode on the Cavaliers. For many administrative holdovers from the Wyatt administration, Governor Berkeley's arrival signaled immediate political ruin as he replaced them with his own men to whom he owed favors or who he knew would be reliant on him, and he'd be able to build some favors that way. Patronage is patronage, after all. But Richard Lee was a talented young man. He possessed a remarkable ability to navigate these political transitions unharmed, as he was to show throughout his life. This time, instead of retreating into the background, Lee managed to use his administrative talents, legal sophistication, at least for the colony, and his wife's connections, thank goodness he married Anne, to make himself indispensable to the new governor. In fact, from what we can tell, Governor Barclay seems to have quite liked him. He recognized in this talented young man not a political threat, but rather someone who was hyper-capable and who shared his Cavalier vision of an ordered hierarchical society. Also, Governor Barclay, whatever his faults later in life, was known for being on the hunt for men who he could include in his inner circle who were talented, connected, well-read, who would be, at least for the time, very good administrators of the colony. Richard Lee I was all of this and more so. And so in 1643, Governor Barclay officially appointed the just 25-year-old Richard Lee to serve as Virginia's very first Attorney General. Lee had successfully pivoted away from his roots, turning not just from a young merchant into the Attorney General of Virginia, but as a man who could navigate administrations and go from being the favored clerk of the old regime into the top legal guy in the new Berkeley oligarchy. Describing this in his book, The Virginia Dynasties, Clifford Doughty notes how much had aligned behind Richard the Emigrant to make him a success. Describing this point, this dramatic point in Lee's life and how it led to success, he says, quote, "It would seem likely that Lee had studied law before coming to Virginia. The records of the Inns of Court were destroyed during the Civil Wars. He was appointed clerk of the court so soon, April 1640, after his arrival, as to suggest the possibility that he came to Virginia with the appointment, and Barclay would scarcely have appointed as Virginia's first Attorney General a man without at least some background in law. Beginning his rise when Barclay came, Lee possessed the three basic requirements: a small sum of money, education, and connections, together with a combination of personal mechanisms unsurpassed in his generation for their fitness to the opportunities in Virginia. He combined acquisitiveness, ambition, commercial enterprise, broadly based resourcefulness, self-discipline, confidence, great boldness, and good health." End quote. And he was to become a major success with all that in his back pocket. Doughty also notes, quote, "This first Richard Lee was a formidable-looking man. In a full-cheeked, oblong face, his features were strongly marked and massive, with a large, straight-line nose that would characterize his descendants for generations. With its self-contained immobility, his face, from the level dark gaze to the knob of chin, looked as invulnerable as the face of a mountain. Of all the English-born newcomers of the first generation of fortune builders, Richard Lee, the emigrant, had come to Virginia with the most exact balance of the qualifications required for a rise to wealth and power in a new world. While his kinsmen remained obscurely well-to-do at home, he seemed fitted by nature to partake of the upward thrust and the ultimate mobility, the adventure to the colony." End quote. And so, with the backing of Governor Barclay, Richard Lee's political and economic ascent over the next decade was nothing short of breathtaking. He systematically monopolized the most important, highly paid offices in the entire colonial apparatus, building a massive base of institutional power that no rival, or even rival family, could really match. In 1646, after having survived the Indian Massacre of 1644, more on that in a bit, he stepped away from the Jamestown capital to assume the critical post of High Sheriff of York County, the wealthiest and most rapidly expanding tobacco district in the colony. In this role, Lee was the primary tax collector and law enforcer for the economic engine of Virginia, a position that allowed him to cultivate deep and personal alliances with the major landholders of this small settled portion of the Tidewater, and to build a hefty fortune through earning a percentage of the revenues he collected, a fortune he was interested in using to build a landed empire. Lee's friends were both the common and gubernatorial variety. By 1647, the freeholders of York County respected Lee enough to elect him as their voice in the House of Burgesses, where he directed legislative policy to favor the commercial interests of the planters of the state. His administrative genius could not be contained within the lower house for long, and so in 1649, Governor Berkeley elevated him to the immensely prestigious post of Secretary of State, making Lee the custodian of public records, land patents, and official colonial correspondence. And then in 1651, Richard Lee reached the apex of New World power, at least below the governor, who was always appointed from England, as he was elevated formally to a permanent seat on the Supreme Council of State in Virginia. This was a select 12-man body appointed directly by the British monarch that wielded an incredible amount it was a combination of executive, legislative, and judicial power. And he did all this when he was just 33 years old. At just that young age, the clother's son from Worcester had broken through all the social barriers and secured a place at the undisputed head of what Virginia aristocracy there was, and certainly of what colonial Virginia society there was. So the young man on the make had managed to become not just part of the establishment, but part of its head. To focus exclusively, however, on Richard Lee's political titles and positions is to miss what made him a dynast rather than just a successful colonist. Lee was one of the men who realized that in the landscape of the Chesapeake, political power and economic capital were different sides of the same coin. So he got invested. For one, he didn't rely on agriculture alone. This is something that defined a lot of the first families. As you might expect, given his roots, he built a diversified commercial empire that spanned much of the length of the Atlantic world. For example, on his early days on the York River frontier, Lee recognized the profitability of the fur trade, which is, after all, what he was in Virginia for. And he used that recognition and his talents, capital, political connections to establish an extensive, highly lucrative network, exchanging things like English manufactured blankets, brass kettles, iron axes, with local Indian tribes in exchange for thousands of pristine beaver pelts and deer skins. He then had these pelts tightly packed into heavy wooden hogsheads and shipped them back to the merchant firms of London, where they commanded premium prices among the fashionable elite of Europe. That's the whole fur trade that was at the basis of much American growth. And as his cash reserves grew, Lee managed to aggressively expand his operations over this period, early period of his time in Virginia, buying up direct ownership shares in multiple transatlantic merchant vessels. He continued doing that through life, graduating to larger vessels later on. And he didn't view himself as just a provincial farmer or planter. In his business contracts with English firms, he identified himself as an English merchant trading in Virginia, as noted earlier. And so he managed to operate this sprawling corporate enterprise and started to import indentured laborers while supplying goods to smaller neighborhood of farmers in his area and exporting high-grade tobacco, while also controlling the ships that carried his cargoes back and forth across the oceans. And this was on top of the landed empire he was building, a process he started in 1644 with a relatively large holding of 1,000 acres north of the York River. A great feat for anyone, particularly a man who'd just been there for a few years, but this was to be an impropitious time to start building a landed empire, particularly in that place. For, as Richard Lee was soon to be reminded of, amassing a fortune on the 17th century frontier in Virginia, and indeed on most frontiers through history, required not just talent, not just capital, but immense physical resilience, as it was a world of sudden and cataclysmic violence. This was reinforced in the mind of Lee in the early 1640s, just after he had established his first independent plantation estate at Tyndall's Creek, which is situated on the northern banks of the York River. It was a beautiful but highly exposed front line, and situated on land that had only recently been wrested out of the hands of the native inhabitants, something about which they were not happy. And on the early morning of April 18th, 1644, the Powhatan attacked. They launched a massive, coordinated, multi-river assault designed to try and cleanse the Chesapeake of English settlements, 1622 all over again. In a matter of hours, over 400 English colonists were slaughtered in their fields and in their homes. It was horrible. The York River plain was engulfed in smoke and terror. Faced with death, the annihilation of his dreams, the young Richard Lee, to his credit, did not panic, gathered up his young wife Anne, their infant children, their indentured servants. He armed the servants with muskets and evacuated his household by shallop across the water to safer, more consolidated ground where they could better defend themselves. In fact, it was probably only because he had this boat and was able to transport everyone across the river that he survived. His buildings were burned, his fields were devastated, but Lee was diversified, and his commercial fortune saved him from financial ruin. Uh, all that he had built over his half-decade in the colony up to this point prepared him for this moment. So, dusting himself off and recovering, particularly after the Indians were beaten, which was something that made the colonists love Governor Berkeley, as he did respond quite well to the 1644 attack, Lee decided to absorb the loss, restock his supplies, and prepare for a new and even more aggressive campaign of land speculation and accumulation, moving in once the colonial militia had crushed the native resistance to English rule. And when peace was restored to the Tidewater, Richard Lee unleashed his understanding of colonial land law and land speculation, along with the capital he built up, to start accumulating more and more real estate. His primary weapon in doing so was the headright system, the governmental policy which was designed to encourage immigration in the colony rather than just speculation by granting 50 acres of uncultivated land to any individual who paid for the transportation of a person across the Atlantic to Virginia. We talked about this in our first episode on the series, the one on the plantation system. Smaller farmers use the system to acquire modest homesteads, little farms on the frontier. But a few planters, Richard Lee foremost among them, saw it as a powerful mechanism for land grabbing, as he could use his mercantile partnerships with English ship captains to corner the market on imported labor and thus on the headrights in one such deal. And he did many of these, but just one example. He managed to get a patent for 1,000 contiguous acres of pristine, prime riverfront tobacco property by importing 17 indentured servants and handling all the paperwork, as he had learned to do when a clerk. He repeated this process year after year, transforming human importations of indentured laborers into a real estate machine that compounded quite well. He would use the land to grow tobacco, use the tobacco profits to buy more indentured servants, and use those servants' headrights to secure more prime land early on. Something the Virginia gentry would come to emulate, which, all told, really locked out the smaller yeoman class from some of the finest agricultural land in the colony, where these landed gentlemen built up huge estates of thousands and thousands of acres. Lee was one of the ones who innovated this strategy and who did it the best of all. And so through these means, his trade, his mercantile fortune, his government posts, and his importation of laborers, he built a massive real estate empire totaling around 15,000, 17,000 acres. It was huge. And his holdings, as could be imagined, were expanding quickly over these years. In Gloucester County, he consolidated a magnificent, really highly productive and quite well-built estate that he aptly named Paradise. This was his model enterprise, worked by dozens of laborers, was very successful. And he remained focused throughout this time on how to continue building his wealth and used his speculative eye to spot, really over the late 1640s and early 1650s, that there was this vast, isolated, completely unpeopled peninsula known as the Northern Neck, bordered by the Rappahannock River on the south and the massive Potomac River on its north. Lee recognized before almost anyone else that the deep and wide waters of the Potomac were a huge advantage in terms of trade because they were larger and would allow larger Atlantic merchantmen, to sail directly up to a plantation dock and bypass the middleman fees of some of the southern ports while loading tobacco straight from the curing barns. Of course, this was a feature of many Virginia plantations. On the James River in particular, a lot of the Tidewater planters built their estates so that merchantmen could sail up. But Richard Lee was one of the ones who realized the real advantage that the Potomac had in this respect. So pioneering this wild, large territory, Lee secured colossal tracts of land along Dividing Creek and Matchadock Creek. He wasn't just clearing fields as he did so, though he had his laborers do that. He was building an empire and locking down huge amounts of strategic river frontage that would serve as the bedrock for his family for a very long time. So by the time of his death, official land records indicate that he held title to between 13,000 and 16,000 acres of really prime, some of the best agricultural land in North America, transforming him into one of the absolute wealthiest private individuals of his generation and the wealthiest one at the time of his death. There's one 1,000-acre patent that stands out. Deep in the wilderness along the upper bluffs of the Potomac River, Lee located and patented a pristine tract of timber and rich loam. Decades later, this parcel, carved out by the genius of Worcester's clothier's son, would pass through a series of real estate transactions into the hands of the Washington family, and it became Mount Vernon. The home that would serve as the spiritual cradle of the future American Republic was built directly upon the foundations laid by Richard Lee I, a testament to how deeply the footprints of this single 17th century patriarch shaped the landscape of America. Really, he was an incredible man. Richard wasn't, however, living in a vacuum over this period, for this was the mid-17th century, and over this time, Britain was plunged into a cataclysmic political crisis. Back in England, the long simmering tensions between King Charles I and the Puritan-dominated Parliament erupted into a savage and bloody civil war, and in 1649, the world was rocked to its foundations when the victorious parliamentary forces led by Oliver Cromwell executed King Charles I in public, and then abolished the House of Lords and established a radical, leveling, puritanical republic known as the Commonwealth. Across the ocean, in Virginia, Governor Sir William Berkeley and his inner council, including Secretary of State Richard Lee, viewed these events in horror and immediately declared their unswerving loyalty to the martyred king's exiled son, Prince Charles. Yet further, they defied the new Roundhead regime in London, defiantly proclaiming Virginia to be an independent and compromised bastion of royalist resistance. For Richard Lee, this was not just an abstract political debate either. It wasn't just about political philosophy. It was a crisis as it threatened to sever Virginia's commercial links to the merchant houses of London, which put his transatlantic business empire at risk of a catastrophic implosion, perhaps. Fortunately for him, that didn't happen. And he continued with his political views as a royalist, Cavalier, regardless, and remained committed to the royalist cause. This led to an incident that he's famous for in the spring of 1650, when he undertook a legendary, dangerous journey across the Atlantic, headed to the tiny, crowded Dutch city of Breda, where the young, impoverished, and exiled Prince Charles was living desperately, trying to keep his royal court alive while being pretty much without resources at this point. Lee was there because he carried with him a highly confidential legal document, Sir William Berkeley's old royal gubernatorial commission. And so in a dramatic and emotionally charged audience before the exiled prince, Lee formally surrendered the commission on behalf of Berkeley, demonstrating Virginia's absolute and unwavering commitment to the Stuart line, for this was a way of recognizing Prince Charles as the next king. Charles appreciated it, and in return, Lee was given a freshly drafted sovereign commission, reappointing Governor Berkeley as the governor under the authority of the exiled king, along with a series of secret royal promises designed to reward the Virginia planter class once the monarchy was restored, thanking it for its loyalty. It was also out of this loyalty to the kings, the Stuarts, that Virginia became known as the Old Dominion. All thanks to Richard Lee, sent as an emissary of Governor Berkeley's. But it should be noted that despite the touching nature of this moment for those committed to the royalist cause, it would be quite the mistake to view Richard Lee as ideological here. This was no starry-eyed romantic cavalier who risked everything out of a blind and unthinking loyalty to the crown. Lee, rather, was a practical merchant who understood how to look out for opportunities. So when he planned this grand diplomatic journey to Breda in 1650, he chartered a Dutch merchantman and packed it to the brim with high-grade tobacco from his own plantations. And so he sailed to Holland, not as a diplomat, not purely as a diplomat, but also as a businessman, and sold his huge tobacco crop that he brought with him directly to the Dutch merchants in Rotterdam and Amsterdam. and so managed to bypass expensive customs duties and imperial taxes that have been foisted on him by the English state. It certainly paid to be loyal. And that actually wasn't the end of it. With his pockets full of Dutch guilders, Lee turned around and invested that capital into purchasing the indentures of 38 young English laborers who were stranded in Europe. So when he returned and his ship dropped anchor back in Virginia, Lee didn't just deliver the royal commission of Cavalier legend to Governor Berkeley. He also marched his 38 new field hands directly onto his estates and got them working. He also, never wanted to miss an opportunity, used their head rights to secure another 1,900 acres of prime real estate in the Tidewater. So, out of going to visit the king and show his loyalty, he managed to turn a romantic mission into a few dozen new laborers and 2,000 acres of prime property, along with royal favor. This was the sort of man who founded the Lee dynasty. Really quite incredible. But the geopolitical winds continued to shift, and in 1652, a massive and heavily armed parliamentary naval squadron dropped anchor in the James River, aiming its cannons directly at Jamestown. Governor Berkeley initially contemplated resistance, but soon realized that was suicide, and so he and the council negotiated a peaceful surrender. In exchange of allowing himself to be stripped of office without a fight, Governor Berkeley was allowed to go, and he was retired to his plantation at Green Spring, which he turned into a bastion of Cavalier support, as he's famous for. And while many hardcore royalists wanted to attempt resistance, Lee realized that Cromwell's Commonwealth was, if temporary, still the political reality, and so it had to be managed, not fought to the death, and so he decided to make a peace with it. He resigned his high political offices and stepped away from the politics of Jamestown, packed up his family, and he retreated north to the isolated wilderness of his Dividing Creek estate on the northern neck. All that land came in useful, so he could get away for a bit and focus on his fortune. And so for the next 8 years, while Cromwell ruled in London and Governor Berkeley didn't rule in Jamestown, Richard Lee lived with the quiet and industrious privacy of a country squire. He also directed his vast energy directly into expanding his empire, particularly the agricultural aspect of it, as he was now free from the distraction of politics and could engage in that to the fullest extent. He cleared vast swaths of acreage of timber. He perfected his tobacco curing methods. He consolidated his merchant shipping lanes. Nagel, describing this in The Lees of Virginia, notes, quote, "For 3 years, 1653 to 1656, Richard and Anne lived on a plantation beside the Porpotonk River in the newly created county of Gloucester. It was wilderness, but their advantageous location bestrode roots of Indian commerce. Richard built a warehouse and made his property a center for trade as well as agriculture. Perhaps to denote their relief at being away from the confusion which had overtaken Jamestown, the Lees called their new home Paradise. By another of his astute moves, Richard became at least part owner of a trading ship whose cargoes regularly brought more indentured servants with their head rights, which Richard used to enlarge his Virginia property. With successes like these, Richard never saw himself mainly a planter. Relying on Anne and his business associates to manage affairs at Paradise, he began frequent travels abroad, formally designating himself as an Englishman, was a merchant and trader to Virginia." End quote. Focusing on fortune building rather than the royalist cause didn't just make him richer than ever. He also proved to the Puritan authorities that he was safe and nonviolent, a highly productive economic producer, and this helped ensure that his properties remained unmolested, while less adaptable royalists saw very much the opposite occur and their fortunes get confiscated or taxed into oblivion by the Cromwellian state. Still, this neutrality was put to the test. One such test came when he was on a business trip to London the winter of 1654 to 55, so over that period Nagel describes. Lee, as he prepared to board a vessel at the port of Gravesend to return to Virginia, was accosted by a team of aggressive Commonwealth customs officials who stormed into his quarters and seized a large chest which contained over 200 ounces of the Lee family silver plate. The officials charged Lee with violating English law that forbade the exportation of precious bullion and silver coin out of the realm. This was a problem, as Lee was a man known to have been an intimate diplomatic agent of the exiled king, and so the seizure carried the scent of a trap that could easily lead to imprisonment in the Tower of London, or much worse. Brought before the judges of the Commonwealth Court, Lee didn't surrender. Instead, he used the legal mind that he'd been sharpening in Virginia for a decade and a half and did not plead mercy, and instead argued the truth, which is that the silver plate had been legitimately purchased with the proceeds of his tobacco sales, and he wasn't smuggling currency out of England, but rather getting silver plate that he'd had engraved with the family crest while there back to his home in Virginia. The judges bought it, threw out the charges, and ordered the return of every piece of his silver. Then they handed him an official state passport that let him sail home with his status and his fortune intact. Again, this was the sort of man who could, build the Lee dynasty. By the arrival of the late 1650s, Richard Lee, by focusing on his fortune, had achieved a level of wealth and security that was unprecedented for a colonial immigrant. Indeed, as we noted earlier, when he died, he was the richest man in the colony. He had conquered the Virginia wilderness, accumulated thousands and thousands of acres, and secured his place at the head of the social order, even if he'd left politics for a bit. But he still wanted to be an English gentleman, like his distant family at Cotton Hall, not just a Virginia gentleman. Or so he thought for now. Armed with his immense tobacco fortune, Richard Lee determined to fulfill the dream of every wealthy English merchant. He returned to England and purchased a magnificent, sweeping country estate in Stratford-Langton, a highly fashionable, wealthy eastern suburb of London. This is why we noted his gentry origins earlier. He knew from whom he came. He'd worked his whole life to be here, and he had rejoined the gentry of which his ancestors had been a part. And so he arrived and planned to live at Stratford-Langton for good. He hired a brilliant young English scholar and heraldic expert named John Gibbon to serve as his primary colonial steward and manage his Virginia estate from Dividing Creek. But the man who had built his fortune in Virginia could never really adapt to this. He was a Virginian now and bound to the Tidewater, as kept cropping up over the ensuing years. Particularly in the year 1660, another major shift came. The Commonwealth collapsed. Oliver Cromwell was dead, and the British nation joyfully recalled the exiled Prince Charles to ascend to the throne as King Charles II. The restoration was a moment of triumph for Governor Sir William Berkeley, who was reinstated as the royal governor of Virginia. Berkeley immediately wrote to his old diplomatic partner and friend in London, calling on Richard Lee I to return to the Chesapeake and take up his rightful place on the newly reconstituted Council of State. The Puritans were gone. Simultaneously, the political capital that Lee had deposited in Breda 10 years earlier was suddenly paying large dividends. So the royal government showered the Lee family with official praise, and so Lee found himself pulled back into the high-stakes machinery of colonial governance. He could no longer just be a private merchant. He was a pillar, really, of the restored royal order in America, and he got tasked with rewriting the laws of the colony to permanently secure the economic and social dominance of the planter aristocracy against the rising threat of what was seen by people like Berkeley as a populist underclass. So the great man had a new great mission and reason to return to the New World. Things progressed. By 1662, Richard Lee was attempting to forge a compromise between his two worlds. For one, he moved his family into an even more secure and elite residential enclave outside London, as he was determined to educate his children in the finest academies of England, while also staying involved with Virginia and using his transatlantic ships to manage his Virginia properties from afar. But the pull of the New World was too powerful for Richard to ignore, and he soon realized that his children's destiny, whatever their education in England, which is where many Virginians sent their kids to be educated, but really their destiny lay in the vast spaces of the American continent, where the Lee name held sway over thousands of productive acres and really carried weight. It's where they could go to be a dynasty rather than just another gentry family. And so, in the early months of 1664, sensing his declining health and realizing that his life's work was nearing its end, Richard Lee sat down at his desk, Dividing Creek, he's back in Virginia, to draft his final will and testament. With a firm hand, Lee issued an overriding command. The magnificent estate at Stratford-Langton, the work of a lifetime, was to be sold off. And the huge cash proceeds from that sale were to be used for things like satisfying all the remaining commercial debts on him and providing substantial dowries for his daughters. His kids were to return home to Virginia and there continue to live out the family's destiny, and the different plantations he owned were apportioned amongst the sons. More on that in the next episode. His wife Anne and nearly all the children, with the exception of his son Francis, who was left behind to manage the counting house in London, mercantile enterprise, were ordered to pack up their belongings, board a merchant vessel, and relocate back to Virginia, back in the wilderness. Richard Lee had made what was a historic choice. He rejected the old world and commanded his descendants to firmly and permanently plant their bloodline in the soil of the New World. Again, we'll discuss the myth surrounding that and how it played out in reality in the next episode on the Lee family. But for now, it's just worth remembering he pulled his family back to Virginia. The reason the Lee family echoes through history as it does is because of this decision to not stay in England, but return to Virginia. His days were few, and in March of the year 1664, inside the walls of his primary plantation on Dividing Creek, Richard Lee I drew his final breath. He was somewhere around 46 years old, a man who had packed multiple lifetimes of adventure, commerce, diplomacy, even nation building into less than 5 decades. Men died early in Virginia in those days. And Richard Lee I was buried in his own land within sight of the great river highway that carried his ships to the ends of the earth. He died not as an English country gentleman, but as a proud, elite Virginian, the architect of a New World barony, and a life that in the end he chose over his English roots. The merchant son from Worcester had entered the colony with nothing but his wits, his literacy, a few connections, and a little bit of capital. He left it as one of the most powerful patriarchs in American history, having successfully laid down the economic, territorial, and political foundations of a family empire that would outlive the British crown and America itself. A family that would be great for centuries and dominate the pages of American history. And so that's where we end it. Next time, we'll pick up on Wednesday first with the addendum episode on the Norman heritage of the Lee family. And then next weekend, go to the next generation and discuss how the Lees went from this dynast, this great man, to the next generation of the dynasty, covering the many sons of Richard Lee I, the progenitors of what became the Stratford Hall and Lee Sylvania lines, and the life and times of Richard Lee II, also known as the Scholar. Stay tuned and enjoy. I really appreciate you listening. And as always, remember to comment, like, and subscribe, as that's how we grow this channel. But thanks again, and bye.